Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Nuclear countdown. The U.S. and Iran have 60 days to reach a nuclear agreement and a more permanent peace deal. But face-to-face talks in Switzerland are already delayed, with Vice President J.D. Vance not leaving Thursday as expected. Oil is headed for a substantial weekly drop as ships are now back sailing through the Strait of Hormuz, with the U.S. declaring an end to its naval blockade. And Andy Burnham wins a contest for an open UK parliamentary seat, paving the way for the Greater Manchester mayor to challenge Prime Minister Keir Starmer for the top job. It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Abir Abu Amar in Dubai. Happy Friday and a happy week for risk assets across the board. It's been quite a pivotal week, starting with the U.S.-Iran truce, Kevin Warsh's first meeting as Fed chair, and the BOJ hiking rates to the highest level since 1995. Let's take a look at where equity futures are this morning. S&P futures 0.4 lower. Now they're trimming some of the gains that we saw in the S&P 500 yesterday. Something to note is that the U.S. is closed today for Juneteenth, a public holiday. But perhaps we talk about what happened in the S&P yesterday. A 1.1% gain led by chip makers. Yet again, Intel rising about 11% after President Trump said they would work with Apple to start manufacturing those chips within the United States. So we saw that rally carry through the SOX index, which is about 100% higher since the start of the year, and a substantial increase in it yesterday. Asian equities are 1% lower this morning. The MSCI Asia Pacific was being led higher by the Kospi in South Korea, but now we're seeing some drop in the wider equities and lower volumes in trading today against holidays in China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Brent crude prices lower again. This week, we're seeing Brent at around $79 a barrel. Again, levels we hadn't seen since the start of this war. We still monitor the traffic and the movement in the Strait of Hormuz, something to keep an eye on over the next 30 days or so. U.S. Treasuries, the cash trading on those is closed today. Again, Juneteenth in the United States. But we're taking a look at the Bloomberg spot dollar index. The dollar is gaining for a third straight session this morning. 1/10 higher, again, an asset that we've been looking at since the start of this war. Now, if we flip the board, we take a look at an interesting chart put through by our markets team, and that is how U.S. semis are driving a new equity regime. So the ratio of the SOX index, that is the gauge for chip makers or semiconductors, to the S&P 500, an incredibly busy day of flow in the United States yesterday ahead of the public holiday today. And the performance of the SOX index indicated that shorts are quite done with setting money on fire. Traders also seem to be wanting to buy more dispersion, as pointed by the lower half of that chart. Now, turning to the geopolitical story in the region, the U.S.-Iran interim peace deal is now in effect. Washington has declared an end to its blockade, and a complex negotiation period over Tehran's nuclear program is set to begin. Meanwhile, oil shipments through the key maritime waterway have begun in earnest.
I think the president's peace plan in Iran is already bearing real fruits for the American people. Last night, 12.5 million barrels of oil went through the Strait of Hormuz. That is a high since the beginning of the conflict.
Joining me now is Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, Bloomberg's executive editor for the Middle East, North Africa, and Russia. Stuart, good news. We're getting good news throughout the week, but there is still some conflicts in what we're getting from the Iran side and the U.S. side. The latest is about the 60-day period of which the Strait of Hormuz would be opened toll-free, and then there's some conflict afterwards. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a litany of things where we're going to have, I think, a difference of opinion between Iran and probably most of the rest of the world. So, yes, I mean, the tolls on Hormuz, hugely important. And as you know, I think the feeling within the region is that that's going to be really difficult to resolve. And as you know, most of the countries in the Persian Gulf are actively working on plans to bypass Hormuz. We had that very nice comment from the UAE saying that, ultimately its goal was zero. or zero dependence. But beyond that, the nuclear file, that's the big one, right? And 60 days, we all know the odds of getting a comprehensive nuclear deal in 60 days are vanishingly small. I wouldn't say impossible, because you never know. But given that the last one took 2 years to negotiate and had some incredibly experienced and knowledgeable people working on it for that period of time, 60 days seems a challenge, to say the least.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole series of things around ballistic missiles, proxies and so on and so forth. So there's a long, long list.
And then there's also the Lebanon issue and the Israel issue. We saw some shots fired between Vice President J.D. Vance telling Israel that the U.S. at this point is their only friend. And then we're getting some Israeli officials also disagreeing with the deal that was reached. How quickly can all of this unravel and actually cause us to go back to square one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good reflection of the problems we're seeing in each of the main parties here. So you're seeing exactly the same thing within Iran, where the hardliners really don't like this deal, and indeed the Supreme Leader has even, I wouldn't say distanced himself, but made it clear that this was someone else's decision. He's happy to go along with it, but if it all goes horribly wrong, it ultimately wasn't his decision. You're seeing the same thing in the US, again, with the Iranian hawks expressing openly extreme disquiet with this deal, and then obviously within Israel itself, the same deal. You've got the hardliners in Israel really unhappy with this deal and saying basically it leaves the job unfinished.
Yeah. Definitely something to keep an eye on, and more comments from those Israeli officials. Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, Bloomberg's executive editor for the Middle East, North Africa, and Russia, always with those details. Now let's get more with Hasnain Malik, Managing Director for Emerging Market Equity and Geopolitical Strategy at Tellimer. Hasnain, good to speak with you and to have you on. Look, I want to focus on the next 30 days and the naval blockade and the removal of that naval blockade. What impact would that have on the economies of the Persian Gulf over the next, again, month or so?
Well, the economies with the most positive exposure to the resumption of oil flows through Hormuz are obviously those ones who suffered the most from the blockade. And that really means within the GCC, the likes of Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, a little further afield, Iraq. Those are the ones that have the highest leverage to the reopening of Hormuz. More broadly, if we do see a ceasefire hold sustainably, then the economy that's the most geared, arguably, is the tourist and transport-driven economy of Dubai. And those would be the ones, I would say, within the region that are the most exposed to the upside of a somewhat durable ceasefire.
And you mentioned, Hasnain, some of the divergences that would be brought about in the aftermath of this conflict between Gulf allies or the GCC. Do you think that once this is done and dusted, that we're going to see more of these divergences fueled? We're talking about the relationship between Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and what impact would that have?
I think it's very unlikely that after this war, and it's still, remember, a big assumption that this war has truly ended. There are many slips ahead between where we are right now and getting a lasting settlement, so going from ceasefire to settlement. If we were to get to that point, there are some scars left by this war. There are scars as far as the U.S.'s relationship with many of its allies, obviously in the region, the memories of how U.S. bases served as a spark for Iranian attacks, a reason for Iranian attacks, rather than a line of defense against those attacks. That will last for a long time. The fact that this war was started by the U.S. and Israel, really without much input from the GCC, who would have been very much against this sort of war, and the fact that once the blockade of Hormuz had started, the U.S. was not able to call upon its traditional allies in NATO, in Europe, in the UK, in India, Japan, South Korea to help unblock Hormuz. Those scars will last for some time. Then you have divisions within the GCC, and obviously the most important one is between Saudi Arabia, which has developed its defense relations more deeply with Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt, and the UAE, which has fallen back on its Abraham Accord relationship with Israel and has also withdrawn from OPEC. So those lasting divisions, that stress, that strain, that will persist. And then, of course, through all of that, you have Iran having emerged arguably as a stronger regional power with a more hardline leadership.
So you bring a very good point here, and it's the shifting sort of paradigms in the region. I remember during the 12-day war last year how Gulf officials, or some Gulf officials, would bring up the point about how Israel could become the biggest regional threat. Do you think that equation has shifted back to Iran being the #1 enemy in the region? Or are Gulf officials, do you think, factoring in the fact that Israel could be a player that could unravel all of this going forward?
I think it depends where you ask that question in the Gulf. So from, for example, the UAE perspective, which bore the brunt of Iranian collateral damage in terms of ballistic missile and drone attacks, there is a legitimate reason for them to regard Iran again as a significant security threat. I think in the rest of the GCC, arguably, some of those countries will regard Iran's actions during this war as having been conducted with some restraint, and this war having been catalyzed by the intelligence, the actions, the rhetoric, and the persuasion that the Israeli government has had on the Trump administration. I think also when you look at the fallout from this war, and again, assuming we have reached the end, which is still a fragile assumption, you look at the state of Israel and you see that it has effectively expanded its territorial control in Syria, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and of course in South Lebanon. And that's why the fact that Israel is not a party to this ceasefire, is openly critical of it, and not just the government, but the opposition in Israel as well. Yeah. Remember, they're going into an election in October where there's no senior politician that wants an end to hostilities on all fronts. I think the view across the broader region, with perhaps the exception of the UAE, is that Israel is still a significant security disruptor in this region.
Hasnain, looking at the deal as it stands right now, what to you is the biggest risk there? What to you could cause the biggest unraveling of the whole peace accord?
I think the first most important thing is to what degree Iran wishes to twin its deal with an end to hostilities in South Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. Because Israel doesn't appear to show any willingness to withdraw from South Lebanon, and Hezbollah is still seeing benefit in demonstrating its ability to fire rockets at northern Israel. So if Iran continues to twin its security with the end of that conflict, I think that's the #1 risk to this ceasefire. Number two is just the fact that, remember, this was just an agreement to stop fighting. This was an agreement to resolve any of the intractable issues around nuclear, around regional proxies, around what has transpired through the war now around the control of the Strait of Hormuz, let alone the regime, the nature of the regime in Iran. None of those issues have been resolved by this deal. All of that remains still to be negotiated. That could take a very long time, with many obstacles along the way, not least obstacles within each country, within the US, within divisions within the Republican Party and within Iran, around how the hardliners and the pragmatic conservatives behave, and of course within Israel, which, as I say, appears to have no interest in a cessation of hostilities in the first place.
Yeah. All right, Hasnain, we'll have to leave it there. Hasnain Malik, Managing Director for Emerging Market Equity and Geopolitical Strategy at Tellimer. Now, for a look at some of the other stories we're following, Bloomberg has learned that U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is concerned that an ASML extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV machine, may have reached China. This would violate U.S.-led export restrictions, and sources say Lutnick raised the issue with ASML leaders in recent meetings. The machines make processors for the likes of NVIDIA and Apple. ASML says it has never shipped an EUV machine to China. Bloomberg has learned that the bankers for SpaceX are preparing to hold calls with investors to discuss a potential bond offering of at least $20 billion. Sources say those calls could begin as soon as Monday. Elon Musk's rocket satellite and AI conglomerate has received ratings in the BBB tier from all three major bond graders, paving the way for cheaper borrowing after its record IPO. And coming up, TenCap tells us why they don't expect the Fed to cut or hike rates this year and what that means for equity markets. Our interview is next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Abir Abamar in Dubai. Global stocks are retreating as investors weigh whether a 60-day diplomatic push between the United States and Iran could yield a nuclear accord and a more durable peace agreement. Joining us now is TenCap founder Jun Bei Liu. Jun Bei, thank you for your time this morning. I want to start with the latest, the deal, the truce, the talk of the week. Do you think markets have completely discounted the risk of this coming back? We've already seen risk assets generally rallying even before the truce had arrived. But do you think the market has completely moved over the risk of geopolitical tensions flaring up?
Absolutely. Look, I think actually the market is a little bit bifurcated. For the risk asset, particularly across tech and others, you are seeing massive rally, and across travel, across all the cyclical sector that's being impacted, it is absolute rally. However, on the other parts of the market, for example, the oil, the energy sector, they have not fallen as far as they should be as pre-war. So our view is that the market is a bit bifurcated. For the risk asset, investors willing to take on some risks and to say that, you know what, we move past the worst. And then on the other hand, still buying a little bit of hedge just in case something might turn out to be disappointing or disruptive. So I do think the market investors hedging their bets at this point.
So you prefer the picks and shovels of the AI trade, not the macro story. We've been seeing what's been happening across the AI trade and the rally in semis and the chip makers and all the positive news that's coming out of the United States. What's the rationale you have when positioning when it comes to artificial intelligence?
Yeah, look, I do think that artificial intelligence is changing the world. And the challenge is here that there's been so much investment into it that we just harder for investors to call who's going to be the ultimate winner. Well, of course, there is the momentum investor where you invest and, in all of the top names, and surely at some point you will generate return. But our view is that a lot of them, you are paying a lot for future earnings and future expected bullish earnings. So the way to play it is really actually play in that whole supply chain. Play in the companies generating earnings today and is benefiting from this increase in spending, which is saw that Goldman Sachs prediction for the investment into the AI is up 40% for 2027. That's an enormous amount of money going into that whole supply chain. Our view is that you play the supply chain, play the picks and shovel, and there the return is much easier to put your hands on.
So do you think then that SpaceX plays into your narrative as well? It's been, I'm looking at the stock's performance. It's dropped for a second day in a row. What do you think of that performance so far?
I think it's been incredible performance, but that's nothing short of, it's really, the vision of what it could be. I know my 12-year-old son tells me he wants to invest in it. And however, for investors, for general investors, that at IPO price, it was close to 100 times revenue. What stops it from going 100 times to go to 200 times revenue? There's no measure of it. It's a lot of hype. Now, my view is that it does generate a lot of excitement into the stock market, into the equity market, and the investors, naturally, we want to look for the next winner. Or and also the whole supply chain that supplies SpaceX, because these are the company really making the money. SpaceX, are they going to generate return? Look, I have a lot of faith, but it is a very high price tag to pay for it at this point.
Jun Bei, it's not just AI though, right? There are other sectors that could be seen as pockets of opportunity given the current circumstances. What are you looking at? Financials, perhaps?
Yeah, look, financials, absolutely. Again, it's almost a result of all the raft of activity that is happening in the US. We know there's 2 more major listings coming through. All the investment banks are going through enormous amount of period of activity. And this is almost unprecedented. Even in the small markets here in Australia, we're hearing the investment banks have a huge amount of pipeline the next 12 months. Look, I think the environment for financials are very, very strong. And in turn, for the entire equity market is actually very strong. Now, just being mindful the areas where you put investment into, but I do think that we are really marking, once we pass the Iran war, energy shock, we are moving into regulatory environment where, we can definitively see market moving higher.
And moving from one political crisis to another region, the UK, I mean, this morning we just had the news about Andy Burnham. What do you think the political disruptions that are happening in the UK, what do you think the impact of those are on risk assets generally within the country?
Sure. Look, the view is that generally, if we see a political party moving from far left to more central left, is better for investor sentiment. It's better for risk asset. It's better for businesses, if you like, in terms of policies. Now, reading through his policies, some of the key policies, tax the rich, be tight on regulation on tech companies, and all of that. It almost seems as if a playbook out of a target towards Gen Z. I do think it's very populist. I don't think it changed all that much in terms of global investors' perspective of the UK. But I do think that some of those policies are now actually moving into more far left than it is.
All right, Jun Bei, we'll have to leave it there. That was TenCap founder Jun Bei Liu. Now, coming up, Zimbabwean lawmakers have approved a constitutional amendment that will lay the ground for President Emmerson Mnangagwa to extend his rule by 2 years. That is coming up. This is Bloomberg. Kuwait has started boosting oil output and plans to exceed 2 million barrels a day within a week. The country has carried out enough repairs to damaged energy infrastructure to quickly increase output and reach pre-war levels earlier than previously thought. Kuwait said all force majeure notices that were issued during the war will be lifted with immediate effect. At least 4 Saudi oil supertankers that had been idling in the Indian Ocean for weeks have set sail towards the Gulf of Oman. The vessels, all owned by Saudi Arabian tanker giant Bahri, made sharp turns early on Thursday. And coming up, Vice President Vance slams Israeli criticism of the U.S.-Iran deal. We'll discuss the strained relationship with Mairav Zonszein from International Crisis Group. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Nuclear countdown. The U.S. and Iran have 60 days to reach a nuclear agreement and a more permanent peace deal. But face-to-face talks in Switzerland are already delayed, with Vice President J.D. Vance not leaving Thursday as expected. Oil is headed for a substantial weekly drop as ships are now back sailing through the Strait of Hormuz, with the U.S. declaring an end to its naval blockade. And Andy Burnham wins a contest for an open UK parliamentary seat, paving the way for the Greater Manchester mayor to challenge Prime Minister Keir Starmer for the top job. It has just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Abir Abu Omar in Dubai. Let's take a quick look at where equity markets are this morning, starting with U.S. futures still tilting a little bit lower, 0.6% lower now. The S&P 500 will be closed in the U.S. today for Juneteenth. And what we're seeing in the futures picture is really trimming the gains that we saw yesterday. The S&P did rise 1.1%, led yet again by semiconductors, those chip makers leading the SOX index to rise over 100% since the start of the year. Yesterday's story was driven by Intel, with President Trump essentially saying that Intel will be working with Apple to start manufacturing those chips in the United States. Moving on to Asian equities, 1% lower this morning. Some markets in Asia are closed. China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan are closed in Asia. And so we're seeing lower volume volumes trading today, but again, some trimming. It was set for a sixth straight session, but that doesn't look like it's going to happen anymore. And then Brent crude prices are at around $79 a barrel. We await to see what further details emerge on the MOU and whether Vice President J.D. Vance does indeed go to Switzerland later. But for now, Brent crude prices are reacting very positively to the news of traffic coming back to the Strait of Hormuz. Cash trading on U.S. Treasuries is closed today, a public holiday there, but the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index is gaining for a third straight session. We've been seeing how the USD was behaving as a haven throughout this war in the Middle East, so something to keep an eye on over the next few weeks. Now, with the interim U.S.-Iran peace deal now in effect, President Trump has stated that it includes a ceasefire on all fronts. The deal has been widely and vocally panned in Israel, with many rejecting a declaration of a permanent truce in Lebanon. In response, Vice President J.D. Vance warned against attacking its, quote, only powerful ally, firing back that Trump is the only head of state sympathetic to Israel right now. Let's discuss further with Mairav Zonszein, senior analyst for Israel at the International Crisis Group. Mairav, thank you for your time this morning. Look, let me start with what we saw this morning. J.D. Vance saying to Israel that the U.S. is its only friend at the time being. We're also hearing some Israeli officials coming back to those statements. What does the political atmosphere look like at the time being in Israel?
Good morning, Abir. It's good to be with you. I mean, in the history of U.S.-Israel relations, the types of things we've been hearing come out of Trump's mouth and J.D. Vance's mouth are quite unique things that maybe some presidents have thought but haven't said, and administrations. A real frustration that Israel is currently the wrench in their plan to get the economy back in motion. So this is something that I think in Israel, the feeling is, I mean, right-wing hawks are appalled by this deal. They feel betrayed by Trump. And I think the majority of Israel is just kind of a headless chicken right now, trying to understand how Netanyahu is going to deal with a president who, you know, has been his kind of campaign buddy, his best friend, the guy who has asked Netanyahu, asked the president of Israel to give Netanyahu a pardon, and Netanyahu has not delivered on any of his war promises. So it's currently a very weird and precarious time.
So where does that leave Prime Minister Netanyahu when it comes to his political standing and the upcoming elections about 4 months away at this point?
It doesn't look good for him, but Netanyahu is a very politically resilient politician. He's been around for 20 years. I mean, the elections are slated for sometime in the fall. There's still no date, and a lot can happen until then. But there's no doubt that, you know, everyone's kind of waiting to see how is Netanyahu going to spin this. And you currently have ongoing conflict in Lebanon. Israelis are not happy with that, and I think they are looking for a direction, and nobody in Israel is giving it to them. So what will happen in the election is hard to predict, but at this point, it's very hard to see how Netanyahu is going to just avoid, losing a lot of votes from this current predicament. Then again, the right-wing base in Israel is very much supportive of more and more military force and more war. And so that's going to be their line, and they're not necessarily going to betray Netanyahu on that specific issue.
So how do the two things square up? How do you square up the relationship with the United States, Israel's biggest ally, but also achieving those goals in southern Lebanon, bearing in mind that Lebanon was a sticking point in the MOU, but also for Iran?
Yeah, I mean, this has been the major, I think, fault line right now between Trump and Netanyahu and between the U.S. interests and Israel interests. I mean, it's very clear that the U.S. currently has put the Strait of Hormuz and the economy in the front seat. That's the priority. And in Israel, that's really not even on the agenda. Israel wanted to remove this regime in Iran. It wanted some kind of, nuclear program completely obliterated. It didn't get any of those things. So again, where Netanyahu is going to go with this is unclear. He has campaigned on being the best friend of the United States, of Trump, so he might have to pivot and say, I'm the only one who knows how to stand up to a U.S. president. But that would be a very difficult position for him to take, as, again, he has gotten so much from Trump in his first and now his second term. So it's hard to predict, but I think this makes Netanyahu extremely dangerous. He might very well try to inflame what is already a very dire situation in Gaza, in the West Bank. And Lebanon remains an active front. And right now we're seeing that this signing, this the beginning of negotiations, whatever they're trying to get started, is currently in some kind of jeopardy, in part because of Israel's refusal to withdraw or to at least cease all fire in South Lebanon. And so that is going to remain, I think, the most pressing issue right now. And Netanyahu, I think, is going to keep going on that line that this is something that he cannot give up on. He cannot, after almost 3 years of war, just decide to leave Lebanon. That's something I don't see happening.
So, Mairav, sitting where you are now, what would you say is the biggest risk for Israel and Netanyahu? Is it the regional threats from abroad or internal polarization?
I mean, Israel is, has open fronts in, several places. It still has troops in Syria and Lebanon and all that. But are any of these, posing existential threats? Can Iran pose an existential threat? No, and Netanyahu has been boasting that even if he hasn't achieved everything he wanted, he has removed the existential threat that Iran posed. So I think the main issue here is the U.S.-Israel relationship and the question of aid. And, we've seen hints both in the European Union and from the U.S. that there might be a change in how they support Israel. It hasn't happened yet. Israel still acts with a lot of impunity. But the big question going forward, and I think for national security experts in Israel, is even if you've gotten a lot of military achievements, if you've lost the U.S. as a real, genuine partner, that's the biggest national security risk to Israel right now, if they don't get the same kind of weapons and aid. And of course, there is now a very vibrant discourse about what kind of U.S.-Israel memorandum of understanding on aid what is it going to look like? I think that is really something that most Israeli national security experts are going to be preoccupied with in the coming weeks.
All right. Mairav Zonszein, Senior Analyst for Israel at the International Crisis Group. Thank you for your time today. Now, Andy Burnham has won a UK parliamentary seat, paving the way for him to challenge Prime Minister Keir Starmer for his job. Burnham won the contest in northwest England, defeating anti-immigration party Reform. The Greater Manchester mayor has made clear his desire on Starmer's office. For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Roz Mattison. Roz, what does this whole thing mean for Prime Minister Keir Starmer?
Well, certainly it puts Keir Starmer under further pressure. He's been under pressure for weeks after a poor performance by Labor in local elections in May. He's been pressured over his policies. His Defence Secretary quit last week in a dispute over funding. And now Andy Burnham has got a seat in Parliament, and he's done that convincingly. The outcome for him was very striking. He did see off the candidate from the far-right party, Reform UK, quite well. And that enables Andy Burnham to say, well, look, I'm the only Labor figure who's got the ability to really try and dilute the impact of Reform UK across the country and into the next national election, which is some years away, and to argue that he's positioned as the one who'll be able to counter Reform UK in that election. So what does that mean for Starmer? Well, he said he wants to fight on. He said that going into this by-election, he'll be under pressure to step down immediately, but he may not. And if he doesn't, then Andy Burnham is positioned to launch a leadership challenge, which would take several months through the summer, potentially be quite messy for Labor as a result. But certainly this starts the clock, some would argue, on Starmer's leadership.
And this is also disappointing for Nigel Farage. He himself wants the top job.
Well, that's right. And of course, just again in May, Reform UK did very well in these local elections, really chipping away at Labor heartlands and with their message, amongst other things, of being against immigration. And so Farage was probably feeling this was also going to be a chance in Makerfield to show that his party can still pull votes. And they did come second, but given the extent of the victories they had just in May, it must be a disappointment. Some of the people who voted in Makerfield potentially for reform only recently have possibly now already switched sides to vote for Labour again. So for Nigel Farage, some disappointment there. One upside for him is that the splinter far-right party called Restore Britain, which split from his own group, didn't perform that well. So we didn't see a split vote on the right. So at least all that right vote seems to be coalescing around Reform UK for now, but certainly not a terrific night for Nigel Farage.
All right, Rosalind Matheson with the latest on those details. Now, coming up, Zimbabwean lawmakers have approved a constitutional amendment that will lay the ground for President Emmerson Mnangagwa to extend his rule by 2 years. That is coming up next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Abir Abu Omar in Dubai. Zimbabwean lawmakers have approved a controversial amendment to the constitution that will lay the ground for President Emmerson Mnangagwa to extend his rule by 2 years. The proposal to extend presidential terms to 7 years was backed by 216 lawmakers, while 42 opposed it. Joining us now to discuss further is our Chief Africa correspondent, Jennifer Zapasaja. Jen, how did this vote to amend the Constitution really come about?
Well, Abir, this really dates back to a few years ago and a few actions that were seemingly kicked off by the ZANU-PF ruling party that has been in power since democracy back in 1980. Now, really what we saw at the time was a proposal by the ZANU-PF party to extend the president's rule because of what they said. They were pleased with the progress he's made in a short space of time. What we saw after that, that was back in about 2024, late 2025, the resolution was eventually taken up, and it was ordered for the government to take the necessary steps to enact the decision, despite the fact that really some of these proposals are supposed to be put up for a referendum. But again, ZANU-PF party has been in power for a number of years, and so they continue to push this forward. Now we are at the point where you were just mentioning there, late on Thursday, we did see a majority of lawmakers approving this decision. And really the question now is, will the president sign this into law? The expectation is that this will move forward, laying the groundwork for his term to be extended into 2030. But still a lot of questions about what this means for Zimbabwe and really what this means again for the continent more broadly, where we're seeing a lot of similar actions being taken about.
And so the reaction to this, both internally and externally, what is the expectation of that to be? It's going to be twofold, Abir, and we're already seeing that play out. If you take a look at the African continent, a number of leaders across the continent are among the oldest leaders in the world. Of course, we can look at a number of countries globally that make up the top 10 list if you were to look at that. But still, what we've seen over the past few years is really a number of countries have chosen to amend their constitutions, extending some of these leaders who have been in power for a number of decades. And I'm talking about presidents such as the president of Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, and also Malawi. That, of course, coming on a continent, across a continent that has among the youngest populations in the world. And so it's going to be taken, depending on which population you're talking to, it's going to be taken a bit differently. From an investor perspective, and I've even anecdotally heard this from a few leaders, if you do see some of these older leaders staying into power, and on one hand, it is a sense of continuity for investors. Perhaps it reduces election risk. But on the other hand, for Zimbabwe in particular, that has been shut out from global markets for a number of years, it could continue to raise questions about governance, accountability, and really what protections and safeguarding of the economy and the government more broadly looks like going forward. But still, we'll wait to see whether or not President Mnangagwa will sign this into law. All right. Bloomberg's Jennifer Sapasaja in Johannesburg with those details. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following. Nigeria's tax revenue surged 49% in the first 5 months of the year, exceeding government projections. The revenue bump was largely driven by an overhaul of the tax system and new levies on industries, including petroleum and mining. Last year, Nigeria enacted sweeping changes to its tax code as part of a plan to raise revenue to 18% of GDP by 2030. Kenyan lawmakers watered down a slew of tax proposals fronted by the Treasury that would have raised nearly $1 billion. The National Assembly rejected measures including a 25% excise duty on imported mobile phones. Kenya has been under pressure from the IMF to collect more revenue, spend prudently, and eradicate corruption. Kenya expects to spend no more than $1.19 billion on the construction of a new passenger terminal and the rehabilitation of existing facilities at its biggest airport. Kenya's Transport Secretary also said the bidding process for the upgrade of Jomo Kenyatta International Airport was open to all qualified local and international firms. Coming up, Lithuania's president says the European Union should not rush into peace talks with Russia. We have that interview next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Abir Abu Omar in Dubai. Lithuanian President Gitanas Nauseda says the European Union should not rush into peace talks with Russia because Putin does not want to see the EU at the table. The Lithuanian president spoke with Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Brussels.
I always say that the moment or appropriate moment for such kind of activities is when Russia understands that they have to make some concessions too. If they will show some willingness or some positive signals that they want to start the peace negotiations, then it might be probably the right moment to start these activities. And another very important factor is that European Union have to speak one voice. We had a lot of the efforts and attempts of different leaders of individual member states to start to talk with Putin, and they all failed. So I think this time we have to learn those lessons of the past and to speak one voice, and it would be much better for European Union.
Do you think it would be wise then for the Europeans to establish who that voice will be, what that voice will be? Because we've had some suggestions. It could be someone like Angela Merkel, Mario Draghi. Do you think there are any sort of serious contenders in order to get that process moving?
Well, I cannot say the name, but it might be. Of course, this person should play an important role in international politics. Maybe this might be the former politician, but I don't think that right now it's a time to start the negotiations with Putin, because Putin does not want to see us at the table. Putin respects the strength. Putin respects and is afraid of United States. Is he so afraid of European Union? I have my doubts. Yes, we imposed 20 packages of sanctions. Yes, we have certain leverage to make harm for Russian economy. Is it enough for Putin to see us at the table? I have my doubts.
And thinking about sort of the other geopolitical event that has really dominated the world for the last few months, obviously it's the war in Iran, the great many consequences that has had across the world, including the energy prices and inflation here in Europe. I'd like to just get your assessment on kind of where we stand now. It seems there is this memorandum of understanding. How active do you think this will be a conversation at the Council, particularly around what Europe's role could be in the Strait of Hormuz and securing it and to make sure there is a free passage of ships?
We have to support United States' efforts to find a solution, diplomatic solution. I hope we are at this point where we can find sustainable solution and free the traffic in the Hormuz Strait. And for Europe, of course, we have to support the United States activities, and probably there is no need to talk about the war, which does not affect us or something like that. For us, it's very important to keep this region stable, to keep the traffic, maritime traffic stable, because as you rightly mentioned, it has huge impact on the oil prices, on inflation, and probably there's another lesson we have to learn from this.
Lithuanian President Gitanas Nauseda speaking to Bloomberg's Oliver Crook. Now, before we head into the weekend, let's take a quick look at where equity futures are. Everything is in the red. A correction from yesterday's performance. S&P futures 0.6 lower. The S&P is going to be closed today for a public holiday. We're seeing similar performance across the Nasdaq and Dow Jones. Euro Stoxx 50 also 0.7% lower. And oil prices are also tilting lower because of the movement in the Strait of Hormuz. Brent is at $79.6 a barrel. Now that's it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Abir Abu Omar in Dubai. Stick around with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.